Their commanders warned them Americans would torture them, starve them, strip away every piece of their dignity. But when these Japanese soldiers arrived at Camp McCoy in 1944, what destroyed them wasn't brutality. It was hamburgers and Coca-Cola. They prepared themselves for death, not for this. The train doors opened in Wisconsin's frozen winter of 1944. Out stepped dozens of Japanese prisoners, blinking against the pale winter light, their uniforms torn and barely holding together. Some clothes were patched with thread or fabric scraps, held together by desperation and whatever materials they could find. You could see the hunger in every face, hollow cheeks that made their bones prominent, exhausted eyes that had seen too much, cracked lips from weeks of poor rations and long transport across the ocean. Their bodies told the story of men who'd been slowly starving for months, men who'd learned what it meant to go without. Every man had learned the same lesson from day one in the Imperial Army. Capture meant shame. Capture was worse than death. Their superiors had drilled it into them from the moment they put on the uniform. Americans would torture prisoners, starve them, humiliate them until they begged to die. They'd been told stories, vivid descriptions of what happened to soldiers who surrendered. The message was clear. Better to die fighting than to live as a captive. Many expected to be beaten the second they stepped off that train. What they saw made them stop and stare. Wooden barracks lined up in the snow. Guard towers, barbed wire, armed sentries. But something felt wrong, or rather, not as wrong as it should have been. There was order here, almost a sense of routine. The camp ran like a machine, but it didn't look like the hell they'd been promised. Trucks drove past on camp roads. Smoke rose from kitchen chimneys carrying the smell of real food. Rich, heavy smells. Nothing like the thin soup they'd been living on. Some prisoners glanced at each other nervously. Others kept their heads down, refusing to show any curiosity. Guards shouted commands in English. Fast, sharp orders the prisoners couldn't understand. But the tone was firm, not savage. Interpreters translated, "Line up, move forward, stay in formation." Then something shocked them. Red Cross officials stood watching from the side, clipboards in hand. The prisoners had been told America was lawless, brutal, didn't care about treaties. But here were neutral observers making sure rules were followed. Could this be real? The intake process was mechanical but strangely humane. They were deloused, their infested uniforms burned. Medical staff checked for fever, malnutrition, broken bones. One Japanese soldier had a bandaged arm. He expected to be ignored. Instead, an American medic examined the wound, cleaned it, wrapped it with fresh bandages. The soldier sat frozen. He couldn't match this act of care with the image of the savage enemy he'd been taught to fear. One prisoner whispered to another, "Why do this? We're their enemies. We mean nothing to them." The other shook his head. "It's a trick." Just wait. The fear stayed with them. Every step felt like it might lead to the punishment they'd been promised. But every hour showed them something stranger. The Geneva Convention, they'd heard that phrase whispered before, but never believed it would actually matter. After registration, they marched across the yard to their quarters. Snow crunched under their boots with each step. The cold cut through their thin coats, biting at exposed skin. But the barracks, rough as they were, had heating stoves that radiated warmth. Rows of bunks arranged in orderly lines, wool blankets stacked at the foot of each bed. This wasn't home, wasn't freedom, but it was shelter, and that alone was more than many of them had expected. Some prisoners sat down carefully on the mattresses, pressing their hands against them like the softness might disappear if they applied too much pressure. They tested the springs gently, uncertain if this could be real. Barbed wire surrounded everything, visible through every window, stretched across every view. A constant reminder they were captives, that freedom was on the other side of that fence, but unreachable. But inside, the men noticed something they couldn't ignore. The camp ran like clockwork, sure, with schedules and routines and regulations, but not like a dungeon, not like a place designed to break men's spirits. The difference ate at them. gnawed at their understanding of how war was supposed to work. All their lives they'd been told that capture meant being treated worse than animals, that surrender destroyed your honor and made you nothing in the enemy's eyes. But here at Camp McCoy, the first impressions carved themselves differently. A guard helping a sick man stay on his feet, a medic wrapping bandages carefully, a Red Cross worker checking that food portions were fair. The men didn't relax. Not yet. Suspicion lived in their chests. But as night fell and they lay on actual cots under real blankets, they couldn't help wondering. Maybe the biggest shock wasn't being captured at all. Maybe it was how capture looked nothing like the nightmare they'd been ready for. For soldiers who'd expected cruelty, the first day at Camp McCoy started something they had no words for. But the real shock wouldn't come from rules or barracks. It would come on a tray in the mess hall, announced by the smell of meat and the hiss of opening soda bottles. The next morning, they didn't wake up to beatings or screaming. They woke to a bugle call. The sound startled many of them, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. They'd heard the same sound back in Japan in their own camps. For a second, some of them forgot where they were. Then reality came back with the sound of boots and English voices outside. They were ordered into formation. Roll call, then directed toward the mess hall. The fear of what came next sat heavy in their chests. Many expected food would be withheld or they'd get scraps not fit for animals. Hunger had been their constant companion in the Pacific. Meals had shrunk to bowls of watery rice, sometimes barley, if they were lucky a few pickled vegetables. Meat was rare, sugar almost mythical. But before food, there were procedures. The prisoners gathered in a large room. A Red Cross representative spoke to them through an interpreter. He explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. They would be fed, housed, allowed to write letters home. They'd work, but only under certain conditions. They wouldn't be abused. Neutral officials would visit regularly to make sure these rules were respected. The words hit them like stones. Some men looked down, ashamed to hear this. Others whispered among themselves, not convinced. One soldier muttered to his friend, "They talk about rights, but we're prisoners. Why bother?" The interpreter paused to let the murmurs die down. "These aren't promises," he said. "These are rules. For you, for them. They're binding." The weight of those words settled over them. After that came more medical examinations, more thorough than before. Doctors pressed fingers into thin wrists, examining for signs of severe malnutrition. They checked teeth, looking for scurvy and decay. Blood pressure was measured with careful attention. Prisoners were weighed, and many came in far under healthy ranges. Some American medical staff shook their heads quietly at the numbers, making notes on clipboards. The malnutrition was obvious in every measurement, every reading. Yet nobody mocked them for their weakness. Nobody laughed at their skeletal frames. A corporal even distributed vitamins, small chalky tablets that confused the men. Medicine for enemies? It felt almost insulting in its kindness. Why waste resources on prisoners? By the afternoon, they received fresh clothing. Plain, serviceable uniforms marked clearly with PW in large letters across the back. The garments fit better than their torn remnants from the battlefield. Some prisoners changed slowly, hesitating with each button, as though every piece of American clothing was another surrender of their identity, another layer of their old selves being stripped away. Others embraced the warmth gratefully, their bodies finally stopping the constant shivering as the Wisconsin wind howled outside. The guards themselves presented another puzzle. Yes, they carried rifles. Yes, they were strict and watchful, always alert, always maintaining the perimeter. But they didn't spit on the prisoners or strike them for moving too slowly or responding incorrectly. They enforced order without cruelty, maintaining discipline through firm commands rather than violence. When one elderly prisoner stumbled on an icy path, losing his footing on the treacherous surface, a guard reached down and pulled him up by the arm. No kick, no insult, just a brief nod before moving on. It was deeply confusing to men who'd been taught that enemies showed no mercy. That night, as prisoners lay in their barracks, Conversations flowed in low, heavy tones. The darkness made it easier to speak fears aloud. "Can you believe them?" one man asked, staring up at the ceiling beams, watching shadows dance in the dim light. "They talk about rules like this is some kind of arrangement, like we're guests instead of captives." "Don't they hate us?" another replied, his voice uncertain. "They must be pretending, setting a trap to make us talk, to get information. This kindness, it can't be real." And yet, when silence settled and men tried to sleep, the smell from the kitchens carried over again. Thick, rich, fatty, not the sour, thin broths they'd known from the Pacific Islands. Something whole, something that promised actual nourishment. Their stomachs responded involuntarily, growling and churning, betraying their attempts to maintain dignified indifference. The Americans, it seemed, didn't treat food as a weapon or a privilege.
For them it was routine. A Tuesday dinner, a Thursday lunch, nothing exceptional. But for Japanese prisoners who'd marched half dead through jungles and across beaches, who'd watched comrades die from starvation as much as from bullets, food was everything. It was survival. It was hope. It was the difference between life and death. And now they were about to discover just how differently their captors viewed something as basic as a meal. The mess hall doors opened that next day. Prisoners filed in, still wary, still expecting some kind of trick or test. What they saw stopped many of them in their tracks. Long tables arranged in neat rows, benches on either side, American soldiers eating at some tables, laughing and talking. The prisoners were directed to their own section, segregated but not isolated. They could see everything, and then came the trays. Metal trays divided into sections, each section filled with something substantial. A hamburger, thick and steaming, the bun soft and fresh. Mashed potatoes with a pat of butter melting into them. Green beans, actually green, not the pale, overcooked vegetables they'd sometimes received. A slice of bread, white and fluffy. And there, on every tray, sitting in condensation-covered glass bottles, Coca-Cola. The prisoners stood frozen, trays in hand, staring at the food like it might vanish. One man's hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped everything. Another started crying silently, tears running down his face as he looked at more food than he'd seen in months. A third whispered a prayer to ancestors, asking for forgiveness, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. They sat. Nobody ate immediately. They looked at each other, seeking permission, seeking confirmation this was real. Finally, one prisoner picked up the hamburger. He bit into it carefully like he was performing a sacred ritual. His eyes widened. The taste of real meat, seasoned and cooked properly, fat and juice mixing with the bread, overwhelmed his senses. He chewed slowly, savoring every moment, tears now mixing with the food in his mouth. Others followed. The mess hall filled with the sounds of men eating with desperate intensity. Some ate too fast, their stomachs unused to rich food and had to slow down or risk getting sick. Others ate methodically, trying to make each bite last, knowing this might be temporary. The Coca-Cola confused them at first. Sweet, fizzy, unlike anything they'd tasted before. Some loved it immediately. Others found it strange but drank it anyway because it was there, because refusing felt wrong somehow. One prisoner looked around the mess hall with tears streaming down his face. "In the Pacific," he said quietly to the man next to him, "we ate grass. We boiled leather from boots to make something resembling soup. I watched men die with empty stomachs, begging for just one more bowl of rice. And now this. Now hamburgers and this sweet drink." He couldn't finish the thought, couldn't reconcile the two realities. Another prisoner, older, with gray in his hair, spoke with bitterness, mixing with wonder. "Our emperor told us to sacrifice everything, to endure any hardship, and we did. We starved and died for Japan. And here, our enemy feeds us better than our own commanders ever did. What does that mean? What does any of this mean?" The silence that followed was heavy. Nobody had an answer. They just kept eating, mouths full of food their bodies desperately needed, but their minds couldn't accept. The contradiction was almost unbearable. Every bite of that hamburger, every sip of Coca-Cola felt like a betrayal of everything they'd been taught. But their bodies didn't care about loyalty or honor. Their bodies only knew they were finally being fed. Over the following days and weeks, the meals continued. Breakfast brought eggs, bacon, toast, sometimes pancakes dripping with syrup. Lunch offered sandwiches, soup that actually had substance, fruit. Dinner repeated the abundance. Meat, vegetables, bread, occasionally pie or cake for dessert. The prisoners gained weight. Their faces filled out. Their bodies started recovering from months of deprivation. But with physical recovery came psychological torment. Each meal was another reminder of the lie they'd been living under. They'd been told America was weak, that Americans were soft and couldn't endure hardship. They'd been told Japan's spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantages. They'd been told sacrifice was noble and that suffering made warriors stronger. But here was the truth, served 3 times a day on metal trays. America had so much food they could feed their enemies. Not minimal rations, not survival portions, actual good food, the kind of meals that showed a nation with resources to spare. The kind of abundance that suggested maybe Japan's propaganda had gotten some things very, very wrong. After a few weeks, work details began. The prisoners were assigned various tasks around the camp and in the surrounding area. Some worked in the camp's own facilities, maintaining buildings, repairing equipment, keeping the grounds functional. Others were sent to local farms, helping with harvests under guard supervision. The work was hard, but not cruel. They were given appropriate tools, shown what needed to be done, and expected to work at a reasonable pace. What struck them most was watching how Americans worked. The guards on duty didn't just stand around. They helped with heavy lifting sometimes. The farm families who employed prisoner labor treated them with cautious respect. Not friendship exactly, but not hatred either. More like the relationship between employer and employee, complicated by war but still fundamentally recognizing shared humanity. One work crew helped repair a barn. The American farmer whose property it was brought out water regularly made sure they took breaks in the shade, even shared his lunch once. He didn't speak Japanese and they didn't speak English, but he showed them family photographs from his wallet. A wife, children, a dog. Simple gestures that said, I am human. I have a life. I'm not so different from you. The prisoners handled the photographs carefully, nodding, trying to show appreciation for the gesture, even though it confused them deeply. Why would an enemy show weakness like this? Why reveal what you loved, what could be used against you? But the farmer just smiled, put the photos away, and went back to directing their work. These small moments accumulated. A guard sharing a cigarette during a break, another guard teaching them a few English words, an American soldier showing them how to play baseball during recreation time, laughing when they struggled to understand the rules. None of it fit the narrative of savage enemies. None of it matched what they'd been prepared for. Letters from home started arriving after a few months. The Red Cross facilitated the mail, ensuring prisoners could maintain some contact with families in Japan. The letters came through slowly, heavily censored, with sections blacked out, but they came. Prisoners gathered around anyone who received mail, desperate for news from home, hungry for any connection to the world they'd left behind. The letters painted a devastating picture. Families were starving. Cities were being bombed regularly. Food was so scarce that people were eating anything they could find. Bark from trees, wild plants, things that made them sick but at least filled stomachs temporarily. The letters spoke of neighbors dying from hunger and disease, of children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes, of elderly parents too weak to work anymore. One prisoner read a letter from his wife, hands shaking. She wrote about their children crying from hunger, about having nothing to feed them, about considering unthinkable options just to keep them alive. The prisoner looked down at his dinner that night, a dinner that included meat and vegetables and bread and even a small piece of chocolate, and he wept openly. Other prisoners looked away, giving him privacy for his grief, but they understood. They all understood. My family starves, one man said aloud, while I eat hamburgers and drink Coca-Cola. How can I face them when I return? How can I tell them I lived well while they suffered? Another prisoner, trying to offer comfort but struggling himself, replied, You didn't choose this. Capture chose you. Did it? The first man shot back. Or did I choose to survive when honor demanded I die? The guilt was corrosive. It ate at them alongside the good food. Every meal was delicious and devastating. Every comfortable night in a heated barrack came with the knowledge that their families slept in ruins, cold and hungry. The contradiction between their captivity and their families' freedom was almost unbearable. The prisoners behind barbed wire lived better than the citizens of free Japan. The propaganda they'd been raised on became harder to believe with each passing day. They'd been told Japan was superior, that the Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. They'd been told Americans were lazy, decadent, weak from too much comfort. But the evidence contradicted those claims at every turn. Coca-Cola arrived in crates, stacked high, more than anyone could drink. Cigarettes were available, not as rare luxuries, but as common items. Work crews saw American farms with machinery that did the work of dozens of men. They saw barns full of livestock, animals raised just for meat, an abundance that seemed almost wasteful. Fields stretched to the horizon, so much land dedicated to growing food that some crops were left unharvested because there was more than enough. One guard, overhearing prisoners marvel at the seemingly endless farmland, said casually, "This is just Wisconsin. You should see Illinois or Iowa or California." The comment was meant innocently, but it landed like a bomb. The prisoner who'd been speaking lowered his eyes, ashamed of the
envy and despair rising in his chest. The contradictions broke some men quietly. One evening, a prisoner whispered through tears to his bunkmate, "I believed Japan was the center of the world. I believed we were special, chosen, superior. But now I see maybe we're just one small island. Maybe we were told lies to keep us obedient." If you found this story meaningful, if it made you think about the complexity of war and humanity, make sure to subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history. These stories, though buried in time, though often overlooked in favor of more dramatic tales of combat and heroism, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make in the darkest hours, choices that reveal who we really are when everything else is stripped away. They remind us that even in war, even when hate seems absolute, humanity can survive. And sometimes, that humanity is the most powerful weapon of all.